Hello, I'm Kathleen Olive, and I hope you enjoy this resource that has been prepared for Limelight Arts travellers with an interest in the history of medieval Burgundy. In this presentation, I'm going to look at a period that we associate with two art historical terms. Those are Romanesque and Gothic. I'm going to give the lion's share of my time to the Romanesque because in terms of the region of Burgundy, this is its great contribution to Western European art. Romanesque and Gothic, we should say from the outset, are two terms that were not used by people living in the times when this style of art was produced. So Romanesque is a term that we would usually associate with the period 1000 to about 1200, and Gothic, well, that's a bit more of a matter for debate, but let's again use kind of rubbery dates from 1200 to about 1500, very rubbery, these terms. And the people living in those two periods didn't use these words. They're words that are more or less invented by 19th century art historians in order to come up with a kind of a shorthand for talking about a particular style. So they're words that describe style, not historical periods. And the historical period that kind of stretches over both of those styles is one that we refer to as the Middle Ages. So the great contributions of art and architecture that Burgundy has given to Western art are given in this period of the Middle Ages, as they're known. Although people living in this time don't use those terms themselves, they are aware that what is happening in this moment is something important. They do recognize that the kinds of buildings that are being produced and the decorations that are being given to those buildings, particularly ones with a religious purpose, churches, monasteries, religious institutions, they do recognize the significance of those. So, for example, in the year 1048, we believe, we have a monk called Raoul Glaber writing, "In the years that followed the year 1000, we witnessed the rebuilding of churches all over the universe," by that he means Christendom, "but especially in Italy and Gaul. Even if there was no need for it, each Christian community resolved to build sanctuaries more sumptuous than those of its neighbours, as if the world, anxious to cast away its rags, wished to dress in a beautiful white robe of churches." It's such a beautiful description, this description by monk Glaber of the Christian world of the West stretching this mantle of snowy white churches over itself. Snowy white churches because they're predominantly being built in stone. So it's this white mantle, as he describes it, of spiritual protection that's being drawn over Europe thanks to this great church building period. There are lots of reasons why this happens after the year 1000. There's a lot of fear in Christendom in the years leading up to the year 1000 that is going to mean the end of the world as we know it. This is based on complicated interpretations of the Book of Apocalypse that says with the year 1000, basically with any millennium, and it does remind you of our own kind of Y2K fears, but at the end of the millennium, it will be the end of time as well. So there's this renewed religious fervor. Everyone needs to prepare for the end times, be ready, make peace. If you've got money, donate it. If you've got time, donate it. We need to be ready and prepared for the end times. This kind of end of times fervor that grows up in the period. So that's one reason why we see this mantle of churches being spread over the map of Christendom as Glaber describes it. If we look at a map such as this, which shows us the extent to which two religious orders alone would contribute to that great period of church building from about the year 1000 to about the year 1200, you can see that we're talking about, as Raoul Glaber says, an extraordinary rebuilding of churches in Italy and Gaul. And two religious orders in particular really give everything to that impetus. They are both Benedictine orders, so they're both communities within the larger Benedictine order. And the Benedictine order is possibly the most important for Western monasticism at this time. established by Benedict of Norcia, founded through various important institutions such as Monte Cassino, or that established by his sister St Scholastica, for example. We see models being given to men and women who wish to retire from the world, live a life of spiritual isolation, but still give to the world through not just their spiritual activities of prayer, a really important contribution at this time, but also through very practical activities, something that was summed up in the Benedictine creed of ora et labora, pray and work, don't give up work. So the Benedictine order had established this idea that communities of religious needed to be outside the world in a spiritual sense, but still contributing to it. And this has been, at the time of the millennium, a system, a way of understanding Western monasticism that's operated for close on 500 years. But around the year 1000, as Raoul Glaber tells us, there's this instinct that something in that needs to change. And in order to understand just how two Benedictine communities, one associated with Clooney in Burgundy and the other associated with Citeaux in Burgundy, the Cluniacs and the Cistercians respectively, if we can understand how those two communities alone could contribute to the church building that you see here and all of those red and blue dots on your screen, we need to understand something about how the social structure is operating at this time. So around the year 1000, we have a very clear hierarchy operating within society. This is something that we'd be comfortable referring to as a feudal system. But in its own time, it was thought of as an organization of three estates or groups, one responsible for teaching. That was the clergy, who you see here in this beautiful manuscript illumination from the late 13th century, from France, in fact. At extreme left, you see the monk, the clergyman. You have the defenders, kind of a politicized group. They were the knights, as you see in the central figure here. And then you had your third estate, who were your peasants or your farmers. So you see the peasant wearing the dun-coloured robe right here and holding onto his spade. These three groups were not distinct from one another in terms of the mutual operation that society required from them. In fact, we have the Bishop Adalbero telling us in about the year 1020 that the house of the Lord has to be made in three parts. Here on earth, one part prays, so that's our clergy, our teachers, another fights, that's our political class of knights, and yet another works, that's our labouring class or our farmers and peasants. These three belong together and will not tolerate being set at variance with each other to such a degree that the functioning of one is necessary to the work of the other two, and each will bestow its aid on the other. So we've got this mutually dependent system of the three estates, whereby society needs each to play its role in order to work, and each one can build up the role of the other. So the clergy are important teachers of the agricultural community, for example. They also take on members of kind of excess members of knightly families. The knights are protecting the structure that we all live within, and the farmers are feeding us, but these are not mutually distinct operations. They're all required to work together like the limbs of a body in order for society to work. So that while religious communities in that ideal of Benedictine monasticism are removed from worldly life, we shouldn't be tempted, if we're living in a religious community, by the transient pleasures of life, by earthly glory, by earthly power, by earthly trappings. Don't be distracted by those things, but you are still required as a religious community to be a functioning part of this organism of society, both in instructing, but also in accommodating excess members of the aristocracy, fine young men of status, for example, who aren't the heir, aren't the knight, but will go into the church instead. And also in creating safe places for peasants to live and do their work. So to work in the fields, for example, of great monastic institutions. And so thanks to this combination of social structure, key religious beliefs and teachings, And also that millenarian fear, is this the end of the world? What are we going to do about the state of our souls? We do have in Burgundy, just before the millennium, a set of circumstances that allow for the exponential growth of new religious orders. And the most important of those is founded at a place called Clooney. It's founded in 910 by Duke William of Aquitaine, who gives land and property, farm buildings, for example, and most importantly, privileges to a community of monks who have been living at this place called Clooney in very humble circumstances. The privileges he gives them are extraordinary. He says that they don't have to answer to him. He's giving them all of these benefits, both material benefits, but also privileges and the power to self-govern and self-rule. They don't have to answer to him for this. They don't have to answer to a bishop. They answer directly to the Pope. The Pope is the head of them as good Benedictines. But he even says in their foundation charter that what is given to the monastery in terms of its land, in terms of its property, cannot be seized by anyone. He can't take it back. A local bishop can't take it back. Not even the Pope could step in and say, give me all of the property of Clooney. And this is an extraordinary privilege with which to begin the community. And in return, they need to pray for the souls of the Duke and of his family. So an extraordinary foundational charter. What starts off as a reasonably small community will grow in time to become, at Clooney itself, a huge institution. And you see a recreation of Clooney here in its third iteration, so-called Clooney 3, its largest 11th century manifestation, with church and dormitories and farm buildings and in hospitals and places for work to take place, kitchens, all of the infrastructure that you need for a community at this time of up to 300 monks. So Clooney itself will become big, but also what Clooney stands for will spread. And the thing that strikes the Duke about the community at Clooney is their zeal for reform. They want to reform the Benedictine order and take it back to those key precepts of Benedict ora et labora. So we've gone too far away from our original goals, and we need to bring the community of monks back to this reformed life of prayer and work, the two foundational activities of any Benedictine community. So we call them the Cluniacs, but they are a sub-branch of the community of the Benedictine order. So that's one thing that's key about the Cluniac monks is their zeal for reform. But the other thing that's key is that they gradually over time absorb a lot more property. So William has given them a very good deal at the outset, but they also begin to be given more farms, more lands. Monks in other communities say, come and help us. We need your help to reform as well. So they absorb communities in other places. They expand their sphere of influence out. And all of those other communities that they take on answer directly to Clooney now. So according to that foundational charter, they don't answer to a local bishop, they answer to the abbot of Clooney. So that the abbot, the chief figure of the Abbey of Clooney becomes the most important person in the entire sub-branch of the Cluniacs. So all of those people in the new communities that are founded by Clooney in new places, and this is a key way that they expand, the communities who voluntarily join the order of the Cluniacs, all of those places become dependent on the Abbey of Clooney in Burgundy itself. So this is part of the reason why it becomes so big. Yes, lots of people want to come to Clooney and live at Clooney, but Clooney also has to administer all of these other places that it either founds or absorbs over time. So on this map, you see the mother church at Clooney with the big round red marker at Clooney. You see its 5 principal daughters, the principal places that it founds in outside Saint Denis at Paris, for example, or at Souvigny, for example. So these are the 5 principal daughters of the Abbey of Clooney. We see main centres of Cluniac reform indicated with the red triangles. We see priories, much smaller communities that come under the influence of Cluniac in the small red circles at places like Vézelay. And then we see kind of sub-reform districts indicated by pink. And these are just some, because we saw on our map, if we go back to the quote from Raoul Glaber, we can see that the Cluniac spread outside of France. They particularly become important in the north of present-day Spain, thanks in fact to pilgrimage routes, which we'll return to later. So one of the important works of the order, remember work and pray, the Benedictine Creed, one of the most important works that these Benedictine monks served was to offer hospitality to travellers on the road to great pilgrim sites. So it's no coincidence that they tend to have orders established in places that are associated with pilgrimage. It's a rapid rise for Clooney. That permission that Clooney has to take over, to absorb places that willingly want to become part of the community, but also to take over communities and reform them according to Cluniac precepts. Those privileges are granted to Clooney by the Pope in 932. So very quickly it becomes clear that this is an important reform centre. And as I said, all of those dependent institutions that you see, some of whom you see indicated on this map, they answer directly to the Abbot of Clooney, so that the Abbot of Clooney has as much power in time as a Pope or a Holy Roman Emperor, something that we will see becomes quite significant in its history. Clooney expands in a way that changes how communities of religious worship, by the time it has at the point of its third rebuilding, 200 monks. By the time the third rebuilding is finished, 300 monks living just at the centre of Clooney itself in Burgundy. You've got to accommodate all of those people now in the life of the liturgy. Cluniac monks were extraordinarily devoted to reciting church liturgy. At Clooney itself, you could have up to 200 monks celebrating the Mass dressed in white. And the celebration of the Mass could essentially take up most of your day. So Cluniac monks recited convent Mass, which was often followed by a litany of the saints. They said morning Mass, which required them to celebrate the Requiem Mass for deceased brothers, for great founders and patrons of the order, such as William of Aquitaine. Every ordained Cluniac brother had to read a private Mass and sing the entire Psalter, 150 Psalms, every day. So churches have to change in order to accommodate this new reformed way of celebrating the liturgy. Buildings have to get bigger. They have to be good spaces acoustically for the kinds of chanting and singing that will take place within them. They have to accommodate not just the voice of 15 people, but the voice of 200 men singing in unison. So these changes that we see in Clooney, they also begin to change architecture. And in order for architecture to change in the 11th century, you need a fair amount of know-how. So the other thing about these communities, if we go back to that reconstruction of the institution at Clooney itself in Burgundy, is that they become centres for learning and skills-based research as well. So we don't just have monks working on manuscript illumination, which is a kind of cliche that we think of when we think of monks working. We also have types of monks engaged in medical care, so working with herbal remedies and what we would think of as empirical scientific research. We've got agricultural innovations being undertaken by monks. They're really interested in technologies such as water wheels, for example, anything that will make the agricultural part of their work, a significant part of their work, easier. And we also see centres of learning associated with these institutions as well. So kinds of studia, places where young men could learn book learning as well as the more kind of practical knowledge that they needed. So if we have A total transformation of how religious communities are living together thanks to the reforms of the Cluniac order. We're also going to see a total transformation of the kind of spaces that they live within to do that. And also, thanks to their great learning, we'll see know-how that allows for interesting technological advancements there as well. So what you see here is a manuscript illumination from maybe the late 12th century, which is now in the National Library of France in Paris, and it shows the consecration of the great Clooney III by Pope Urban II in 1095. You have the Pope and you also have the Abbot of Clooney, Abbot Hugh, later St Hugh, present for the consecration of this church. Clooney III was the largest church, call it three because there are three iterations of the church on the site at Clooney. It was the largest church in Christendom. It was bigger even than St Peter's in Rome. When it's consecrated in 1095. To build a church that big, you need to lean on the kind of technical know-how and innovation of a community this big and this sophisticated, also a community this diverse. So if we look at surviving religious architecture in the region of Burgundy from this period, we see really interesting kinds of experimentation. And sometimes the Cluniac order is able to accommodate that because of the kinds of people, the caliber of people who rise to positions of importance within the order, and also where those people come from. So in Dijon, we had an early Christian saint called St Benas, who is martyred near the city of Dijon and whose burial site becomes a place of important pilgrimage devotion. And it later becomes the church of St Benas or Saint Benin in the city of Dijon. That church is still there in Dijon today, greatly changed because there were subsequent fires and building collapses and, of course, the French Revolution. So how we see that church today is not how we would have seen it in the 11th century. But in the 11th century, it is rebuilt in order to accommodate large groups of faithful. It is rebuilt under the patronage of a really interesting figure, William of Volpiano. As his name Volpiano might suggest to you, he comes from Italy. His intellectual background is an Italian patrimony with all of the heritage of Rome behind it. He's extremely well connected. His godmother, if memory serves, is the wife of the Holy Roman Emperor. So he's a person, he's not just a lowly monk. The men running this institution of the Cluniac order are from the best families of Europe and have the highest level of education of the time. And William of Volpiano is given this church of St Benas in Dijon to renovate. In fact, it comes under the Cluniac order, so it becomes a dependency of this great abbey at Clooney. And he's kind of charged with renovating it in order to better accommodate the really large groups of pilgrims who come to circle around the tomb monument of St Benas, but also the huge group of clergy whose job as Cluniac monks is to chant the necessary offices and masses at all times of the day. So it's a building that suddenly needs to accommodate a lot more people doing different kinds of things. You've got the clergy, you've got the faithful, and you've got the pilgrims. Everyone's got a different thing that they're trying to achieve within the church. And around 1001, William of Volpiano embarks on this building project that is one of the most extraordinary deals of its time. 1001, we're talking about stone masonry, we're talking about teams of masons and what we would call today engineers who hew the stone on site in order to get it to the right size for the place where it's going, and who use, in some cases, just one set of wooden formwork to erect each bay, each unit of an extraordinarily large building, working from the front door of the building towards the main altar. This was the usual, it's not a hard and fast rule, but this was the usual progression of building in the so-called Romanesque period. And this is a great example of Romanesque architecture because it bears the hallmarks that 19th century art historians associated with this style. It uses round-headed arches on a Roman tradition, thus Romanesque, a kind of reinvigoration of ancient Roman building techniques. It is a relatively low structure. I mean, this, as you'll see in a moment, this is a very large building, but each register of the building is relatively low. We don't really go up too high yet. Our pillars are kind of squat and big, and they're doing a lot of work, in this case as columns, supporting the weight of the levels of the buildings up above. And at St Benas in Dijon, what is now the crypt, what you're looking at here is the crypt. It wasn't the crypt in the time of William of Volpiano. In the time of William of Volpiano, it was a kind of a central rotunda dedicated entirely to the glory of the Mother of God. And it had layer upon layer upon layer. It had 3 stories, this rotunda, each one dedicated to a different Christian figure and therefore idea. So the lower story of this round kind of rotunda section of the church was dedicated to John the Baptist. The second story of this rotunda was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and the third was dedicated to the Holy Spirit. These 3 central circular sections of the church just behind the main altar, associated with the burial place of St Benas, but also serving a kind of symbolic liturgical function. And each layer, each story has to support the weight of the masonry of the level above. So this shorter kind of squat, what is sometimes called cave-like architecture of the Romanesque, is doing a lot of work of structural support. We can't use slender columns. We can't open up lots and lots of windows. We have a central kind of oculus of light, as you can see instead, because structurally that's what we need to do. And these are barrel vaulted stories of architecture. So barrel vaulting at this time is quite we're talking masonry, you know, stone vaulting, round stone vaulting is a very sophisticated construction technique that required, as I said, erecting a kind of a wooden formwork for the masons to follow, using it as their guide for the insertion of the stones, dismantling it, moving to the next bay and doing it again. It's an extraordinary kind of construction process. And this is just a tiny fragment of William of Volpiano's 1001 year vision that survives in the Church of St Benas today in Dijon, because as I said, fires and structural issues and the French Revolution would have different ideas. But this is a plan showing what was designed by William of Volpiano and his architects. And you can see, hopefully where my cursor is indicating here, you can see that rotunda I mentioned, this huge structure at the end of a huge church with, if memory serves, 5 aisles. So a central aisle and 2 sets of side aisles off that central aisle. A 5-aisle church, so accommodating a huge number of people, and that rotunda at the end that allowed pilgrims to circle around the relics of the saint without coming into the contact of the clergy and faithful and the business they're doing in the rest of the church. You can visualize the number of people who are expected to arrive here, but also the number of clergy expected to be singing the Mass here just by the length of the aisle of this church. An extraordinary structure. And there's nothing like this structure, particularly the rotunda, anywhere else in Western Europe at this time. In fact, structurally, the only building remotely like this is the Pantheon in Rome. So there's a lot of debate about where did William of Volpiano and his architects come up with this idea. Architects of these great institutions, by the way, usually being members themselves of the religious order. So people with the highest level of education within the order are also doing the work then of planning for these extraordinary buildings, not the execution of them, which is entrusted to skilled teams of masons, but the planning of these buildings usually lies within the order itself. This is not a very balanced building, as perhaps you can see from the plan here. It doesn't resemble the other great Romanesque buildings of Burgundy. It's very unusual, very unique. And the carved capitals within it, which were probably done in the 1100s, they're not really like some of the sculpture we'll see in the rest of Romanesque Burgundy either. So this first great Romanesque building that we have, which is in Dijon and which survives, as I've said, in a kind of a complicated and compromised way, is nevertheless an indication of the kind of skill, construction skill, that is needed by these great architects of the Romanesque, but also their inventiveness. So this is not a very sophisticated carving, but it is inventive, and it does require use of the imagination by the artist, but also by the viewer who will look at a capital such as this one. So this building spawns no heirs. The building that spawns heirs all over not just Burgundy, but Western Europe, but particularly spawns heirs over Burgundy, is of course the great Clooney III. Now, I've been referring to Clooney III because once the community given those privileges by William of Aquitaine is founded, we have three significant iterations of the church building in which the community worships, and they're just referred to by their kind of chronological order. So that Clooney I is a very small church built under the early Abbot Berno. Within 2 generations, it's not doing its job anymore. Something bigger is needed, and Clooney II is constructed. That's a 3-aisle basilical church. A basilica church is one that has a kind of a central aisle and a nice arm where the main altar is located, cutting across the aisle, and then radiating chapels out the back of the main altar in the area that we refer to in this style as an apse. So Clooney II has 3 aisles in the church. It has a transept, that crossing of the arm with the aisle of the church, and then the choir, so where the monks sit in order to sing the masses, is radiating out the back of the main altar in the so-called apse, or the curved part of a basilical church. That, within 50 years, is not big enough either, because by the early 11th century, the community at Clooney is constitutes about 300 monks, and Clooney II can't accommodate all of them and all of the people who come to worship with them. So in 1088, under the very powerful Abbot Hugh, who after his death will in fact be canonized, St Hugh of Clooney, Clooney III is built. This is a church with 5 aisles and 2 transepts. We've said that a transept is where the main aisle of the church is intersected by an arm, a crossed aisle, and where those 2 places meet is known as the crossing. It's usually where the main altar is, and the clergy usually occupy the space of that arm or transept back to the end of the building behind the main altar. So Clooney II had enough space for the community to sit behind 1 crossing. Clooney III has so many clergy attending services that it needs 2 spaces behind the altar, a so-called sanctuary or choir, to accommodate all of the clergy, and then myriad chapels radiating out the back of that area where the choir sits, in order to allow for patronage by great kings and dukes and popes, religious figures who wanted to endow a permanent space in this church for themselves and their descendants, their family, to be commemorated. It's really hard to conceive of the scale of Clooney III. It was greater, it was a larger church than St Peter's Basilica in Rome. St Peter's Basilica only becomes the biggest church in Christendom in the 16th century, when it's expanded at the time of Michelangelo, Raphael and Bramante. Until that time, Clooney III was the biggest church in Christendom. It's something that might help give you the scale is that the central nave, which was a masonry nave, so it's a masonry vault over the main aisle of the church, was 14 meters wide. So a curved barrel vault made of stone, kind of interlocking arches of stone using that formwork of wood that we've described. That's 14 meters wide in order to span the central aisle of Clooney III. Here's a plan showing you all of those pieces of the puzzle. So if we come from the left, we come into the church, we go through a kind of an area known as a narthex, or a lobby, a porch, a kind of a pre-entrance area. And then when we come into the main space of the church, you can count from top to bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 aisles. The vault in masonry of those aisles is supported by massive piers, as you can see here, themselves of masonry. Those are indicating the bases of the piers that are supporting the weight of the masonry roofing in stone piers. And then when we come down towards the main arm, we get our first crossing with that side arm. But behind it, there is a second crossing, as you can see. And behind that, again, a choir with radiating chapels. So the clergy would usually occupy all of the space from the crossing to the back of the church. So at Clooney 3, I would say, what do you think that is? That's more than 1/3 of the church is occupied by clergy, with the rest of the space for lay worshippers. An extraordinary size. The reason we need 2 kind of subsections for the clergy with those 2 crossings is because we've got different ranks of clergy. When you have 300 monks, not everyone is the same rank of clergy as everyone else. So we've got 2 areas in which our monks can be divided according to their ranks, whether they've taken orders and whether they haven't, essentially. The architecture needs to accommodate the business of this building, which is singing the mass. So the acoustics of this have to be good. This is extraordinarily sophisticated knowledge, and it's one of the monks at Clooney who designs it, because who better to know what the brothers need than someone who lives in this institution, but also where else would you get a community big and wealthy enough to sustain the kind of learning that is required in order to come up with a project like this that works. Now, sadly, we have to look at reconstructions of Clooney 3, because Clooney 3 was after the French Revolution. It fell into a period of neglect and decline. I mean, the community was no longer the size that it had once been at its height. It was a much smaller community living in this vast series of buildings which had been subdivided and used for other things. And those buildings are kind of broken down after the French Revolution for the sum of their architectural parts, which were sold at auction. And as we'll see, it is a kind of a sad portion of Clooney that survives today. If we return to the reconstruction that you see here, all that survives of Clooney 3 today is one of these towers where I'm circling. The north tower, liturgical north, the tower to the north of the altar that is represented by the tower where I'm circling the cursor now. So that is, when you visit Clooney today and you enter this huge church, well, what it is one portion of one arm of the original church. And still its proportions feel huge to you when you visit it today, but it was one fragment of the church of Clooney 3, the most impressive church in Christendom. This is a reconstruction of Clooney 3 showing you the nave with the masonry roof. You know, by the time they get up to the second story of the walls, they are doing so much buffering and support in the masonry walls and in the piers that are engaged through the arches with the next story up, that they are actually able to open in layers of lighting at the top, with what we call a clear story or a clerestory. Let's call the whole thing off, you know, potato, potato. But they have been able to allow more light in by opening up some windows in the upper reaches of this building. So while the lower levels would have been naturally dark, but of course at this time beautifully lit with candles and lamps, so not dark at all, it would have been beautifully illuminated. You can see light can flood in through the upper levels of the church, but not as much as we will come to expect later from Gothic buildings with their very tall, thin openings in thin walls that allow for stained glass, for example. Clooney 3 might not have had stained glass, but do not think that it was devoid of decoration. It had some of the finest carved capitals, all of those engaged piers, the capitals in the area of the choir, lots and lots of opportunity for sculptural decoration in a building of this size. And they are some of the most stylistically sophisticated, but also I think very theologically interesting, because one of the main businesses of the day in Clooney 3 was to sing the Mass. And so these two sculpted capitals that you're seeing here, which survive in the Granary Museum on site at the Abbey of Clooney today, huge building that was, as its name suggests, the granary for the order, where you can now see these sculpted capitals. Unfortunately, many others are either lost or have been dispersed to museums around the world after the actions of the French Revolution. These musicians aren't just interesting for their sculptural technique. When I'm thinking about technique there, I'm thinking about how much high relief they are shown in. They've been really carved almost in the round. They're almost entirely three-dimensional and in the round. They're not, it's one piece of stone, but much drilling and chiseling has been done to bring those bodies out into a sense of high relief, and that's quite technically sophisticated for this time. So too is the way the bodies of these musicians occupy the mandorla or almond shape that they're shown in. It's a very constrictive shape, the almond shape, but they're given this beautiful curve through the line of their body through that restrictive shape. But it's also the job they're doing, because these aren't just any figures, they are musicians, and each musician represents a note in Gregorian chant. So the musical system that is being used by the monks singing in this place is actually embedded into the very decoration of it, which I think is just an indication for you of how sophisticated the men living in these institutions, designing these institutions and building them with purpose in mind, purpose as well as beauty, an extraordinary marriage here of beauty and utility. We're fortunate enough in Burgundy that other Romanesque decorations survive as well. So we tend to think of Romanesque buildings as being reasonably restrained in with respect to their decoration. By restrained, I'm thinking of, for example, think of a Baroque church and how much colourful decoration from colour to gold and luxury materials is present there. And we tend to think of Romanesque churches as being simpler by comparison. But they weren't austere. So we've seen that there were sculpted capitals, for example, in Clooney 3, and there are examples of Romanesque painting that survive in Clooney. And the most precious examples are not far from Clooney at a grange called Baiser-la-Vie, and kind of an agricultural community of monks that came under the purview of the abbot of Clooney, was used by the abbots of Clooney as a kind of a summer villa residence, more or less, not far from Clooney itself. And the church there is known as the Chapelle des Moines, or the Chapel of the Monks. And the Chapel of the Monks at Baiser-la-Vie was used, as I said, by the abbots of Clooney themselves. And inside it is decorated with frescoes. And these frescoes are interesting because they do refer symbolically back to Clooney itself. Now, Clooney, when it is founded by William of Aquitaine, remember that it depends directly on the Pope. And the Pope occupies the throne of St. Peter. He is the direct heir to the role of Peter, who Christ said was the rock on which he would build his church. So Clooney as an institution is dedicated to St. Peter and Paul, the two great authors of the Christian church, Peter being the author of the church in Rome and the great evangelizer to the Jews of the role of Christ, and Paul being the great evangelizer to the Gentiles, so the great missionary who will spread the word through the rest of the world as well. So the two fathers of the church in that sense. Peter and Paul were so symbolic to the order of Clooney that Abbot Hugh, the great patron and architect and general, if you like, of the Cluniac order at the time of the construction of Clooney 3, when he is elected abbot, He delays his investiture until the feast day of St. Peter, so that as he takes on the mantle of Clooney, directly answerable to the Pope or the throne of St. Peter and dedicated to St. Peter and Paul, his very day of taking on that role will be forever associated with St. Peter. So you can see that Peter and Paul have this great symbolic resonance for the Cluniac order. And inside that small chapel of the monks, we find precious frescoes from the early 12th century that don't just show us Christ in Majesty, which is what's happening in that central figure of this fresco decoration, but also show us the role of Peter and Paul within the spreading of Christ's word, with the evangelization that Christians are supposed to achieve. We see there also the role of Clooney itself being alluded to in this symbolic relationship between Clooney and Peter and Paul, and between Peter and Paul and Christ. So you have Christ, if we pull in on a detail here, you can see Christ in what is known again as a mandala, or an almond shape. So he's inside his own kind of sphere or orb, represented by that almond shape. The weight of his body bending the cushion that he sits on, the robes shown as flowing over his knees so beautifully, almost like an ancient toga. With his right hand, he blesses. His two blessing fingers, in fact, held over the head of none other than St. Paul, the bald man that you see directly under Christ's blessing fingers. And on our right, Christ hands almost a charter, his testament, you could think of it, to St. Peter, who clings in one hand very firmly the keys to the kingdom of heaven, which Christ says that he is given the power to lock and unlock. So this is an investiture. This is Christ investing Paul on our left and Peter on our right with the power to go forth. It's a mission, really, to go forth and evangelize, to spread the news of his testament. So that's a Christ in Majesty. He's kind of gloriously charging not only Peter and Paul, but also, as you see around them, the various apostles with this duty. And then underneath and below, if we go back to the overall scene, we see various representations of other saints, of flowers, of almost mosaic-like decoration. And if you look at the painted bands, if you look at the insets around the window of flowers on a dark field, this extraordinarily lavish decoration, principally using the colors blue, green, red, and a kind of ochre yellow, some of which, if we pull back in on the detail, are very high grade and were quite expensive, came from quite a way away. It's not just the pigments that come from quite a way away here, because in fact the style of these frescoes in kind of agricultural Burgundy, this small kind of region in central Western Europe, the style of them isn't local at all. In fact, it's influenced by mosaics in Ravenna, for example, and frescoes, contemporary frescoes in churches in Constantinople. So it's an extraordinary demonstration of the reach of this order, of how far they can go in order to get the supplies they need, but also the aesthetic influences they like. And it's also a powerful reminder when the Abbot of Clooney is on holidays here of that significant relationship that he has almost in direct line from Christ to Peter and Paul, to the Pope, and then on to himself. It's an extraordinary indication of the power of the monks of Clooney. It's not usually painted decoration that we think of, though, when we think of the great art forms of the Romanesque. We usually think of Romanesque sculpture. And Romanesque sculpture in the region of Burgundy, thanks to this flourishing of the Cluniac order from the 11th century, is some of the most important in the Western art tradition. It is technically sophisticated, as I've said, but it also shows again and again a kind of stylistic inventiveness. And the place most strongly associated, well, there are two places I would say really strongly associated with inventiveness in sculpture. As soon as I say that, I think of a third place, but in inventiveness in sculpture in the 11th and 12th centuries. Let's keep it confined to that. One is Autun and the other is Vézelay. So let's look first at Autun. And in Autun, we are particularly considering the Cathedral of St Lazare. In other words, a church dedicated to St Lazarus. Now, I won't go into it, but for complicated reasons, Mary Magdalene and her brother Lazarus are shortly after the death of Christ. They've spent some time evangelizing after Christ's death. You know, Lazarus was risen from the dead thanks to Christ, and Mary Magdalene had one of the closest spiritual relationships with Christ in his lifetime. These two, together with their sister Martha, are put into a boat by their persecutors, and the boat is pushed off from Palestine and conducted due to divine means to the south of France. And Mary and her sister Martha and her brother Lazarus spend the final years of their lives Christianizing the people of southern France, particularly associated with places like Marseille, but also the Camargue. Over time, however, their relics are translated. They're moved from southern France to other places. Mary Magdalene becomes associated with the town of Vézelay, which we'll come to, and her brother Lazarus with the town of Autun. And this cathedral is built in his honor before his relics even get there. You know, they start construction in 1120, and in 1146, Lazarus is brought here from Marseille. It's really a great example of if you build it, he will come. So the building of this beautiful church does manage to execute the translation of the relics of Lazarus to Autun. The design of this church is maybe one of the best examples of the mathematical precision of the Romanesque that we can find. Remember, masons are using the same formwork, we think. At the most, they might have two sets, so they can do two sides of a church in tandem. They are using the same formwork to create each bay. So each bay of this church is exactly the same size and proportion as its corresponding part on the other side. The regularity of a building like this is deeply soothing to the human psyche. You understand when you stand in this church where you are in relation to all the other parts of it. Your body understands that there is a mathematical balance and proportion and symmetry here. It's similar to what you experience in a Palladian building. So very mathematically rigorous and soothing. We've got, again, a barrel vault in masonry, as I think you can see, which is supported by these extraordinary stone piers and also by an interim floor, which I hope you can see, of blind arches. So you've got the piers springing up from the floor. After their pointed arch above, perhaps you can see a running line of arches, which are blind. They're not windows, they're just recessed. And then above them, again, the clear story or arcade of windows. So there's a fair amount of buffering happening in the masonry in order to support the spring of that masonry roof. There's some interesting architectural innovations here for the Romanesque, which I won't go into, but just to tell you that the central nave is vaulted with a barrel vault, just a simple curved masonry roof, whereas the bays of the side aisles have been formed with a groin vault. So 4 little barrels coming together in a pointed kind of midsection, which I might have an illustration of. Yes, I do. So we've got a barrel vault at top left. We've got a groin vault, which is 4 meeting barrel vaults, giving greater structural support. You know, whatever comes on top of the groin vault is supported by 8 earthing piers. Whatever comes on top of the barrel vault might only be supported by 4 at each terminus point of that vault. So we've got a really strong system of groin vaulting being used on the 2 side aisles, and then the central aisle with that wide barrel vault. I beg your pardon, that is Clooney 3 that I've jumped back to. So I need to take us to, here we are again at Autun. It's got a very sophisticated form of construction and a very regular building in the Cathedral of Autun. But this is not principally what people remember about Autun Cathedral. What they principally remember is the range of sculptural decoration that all of these columns and piers and entranceways, there's 2 different ways to get inside this church, all of these kind of focal points of the architecture allow for a great deal of decoration. And at Autun, most of that seems to have been undertaken by one sculptor and his workshop, and his name is Juz Liberus, and he is thought to have been really the best sculptor, together with two other sculptors working in Italy at this time in the 12th century. They are the pinnacle of European sculpture at that time. Now, it might take your eye a little while to adjust to that idea of how they can be the pinnacle of sculptural decoration in Europe at that time. The tools that are being used here are deceptively simple. We're talking about chisels and drills. So chisels to give us the great outlines, drills to give us the little holes and details like eyes, for example, or the kind of terminal point of fingers is rounded out through the use of drills. We've got kind of claws, claw hammer type things that are used to scrape, rhythmically scrape away stone to give us, for example, the hair in the mane of the donkey, or the details on the robes of Mary. So these are simple tools, and stylistically they're quite simple. I mean, today the word that you often want to use for something like this is charming, because we live post Michelangelo. You know, we're used to our Western European sculpture being highly naturalistic, looking real. And these figures don't look real. They look somehow fantastical. They're from a different world. Some people might use the word primitive to describe them. Their proportions are not entirely right. You know, that tree behind Mary is at least as big as she is, which is a little bit alarming and disturbing. What are the round wheel-like things that the donkey is stepping along? It's a strange kind of fantastical world, and there's something about that for us living post Michelangelo that is quite attractive. It's easy to be charmed by this kind of sculpture. But I think if we only allow ourselves to be charmed, we don't really think about the genius as much. We say, oh, how charming, isn't it fun? It's so fantastical. We don't really think about the achievement of it. So take those strange round things that the donkey and Joseph, because that indeed is Joseph, as we can see from a side angle of this sculpture. You know, sculptures, you walk around, it's such a key thing. Sure, someone might have stood under this sculpture in a fixed position while they were listening to the mass being sung, but usually you're walking around these. So very important to walk around this kind of Romanesque sculpture and get a full view. And if you do that here, you can see that Joseph's leading the way. He's got a sword. He's going to look after his wife and child. He's leading the donkey with that beautiful rope that's been carved with one of those claw-footed hammers. And when you look at those round things underneath Joseph, Mary, and the donkey here, while you still might not be able to work out what they are, they're just stones on the road, really, aren't they? What you do realize is that they give this rhythmic sense of motion, because they do look like wheels, and therefore this becomes a cartoon strip. I can see that they are all moving. The donkey has its foot up so high. They are moving along a road of a stony path. They are in movement. So something that could be quite static, in fact, is given a sense of movement by that strangely abstract way of showing the stones on the path that they walk along. So really, really simple, but actually really fundamental to the entire work. The key example that's often given from the sculpted capitals at Autun to show the sophistication of Juz Liberus, you can tell I'm getting excited because I'm stumbling over my words here, is the dream of the 3 wise men. So before they embark on their great journey following the star, according to the story, the wise men receive an angelic vision while sleeping that tells them, get up and follow the star and you will find the King of the world, the Messiah. So here we have the 3 wise men asleep. all three of them together. They're co-sleepers. They've got one blanket drawn over their bodies, and kind of appearing in their room very quietly, because two of the kings are still sleeping, is an angel who reaches out its right hand and touches one of the kings, whose eyes, bing, spring to life. And the left hand of the angel indicates the star carved on the top of this column, indicates to the three wise men that they must wake up, follow that star, and they will find Christ in the manger. Again, incredibly simple. Notice that the shift of perspective here is quite strange. So we look down on the three men so that we understand they're sleeping in the bed together. They're sharing one pillow, they're sharing one blanket. But by the time we get down to the foot of that bed, we've actually shifted our perspective and we're looking at the bed front on, so that we can understand that the angel is standing behind the bed and touching the king at the top to wake him up. So a real shift in perspective, bird's eye view over the heads of the three magi, so that we see them together. We get that they're the three magi. They're wearing their crowns to bed. These are the three great rulers and great wise men. Got it. But then by the time we get to the foot of the bed, we've shifted our perspective to a frontal one so that we can see the angel waking them up. Now, post Renaissance vision of time and space wouldn't allow that to happen. It's not the great view of the window onto the world that we want a painting to be. It's not naturalistic. But that shift in perspective here gives us more information, brings us into the story in a different way, means that we don't see that gently waking finger of the angel immediately. Immediately we see the kings. It takes you a step further to see that that gentle finger of the angel has woken the king up. He's the only king whose eyes have been drilled open with a tiny little drill to give him holes so that his eyes are open while the other two have their eyes shut. Extraordinary economy. That's the thing I think that Romanesque sculptors such as Juz Liberus excel at. They have these fantastical visions of the world. The plants always look like they've come out of a manuscript and they're going to become triffids who take over the world. Look at that tree that Eve is taking the fruit of knowledge from. It's so luxurious and flourishing. It's so flourishing that it covers her most embarrassing nudity. And yet Juz Liberus gives us the glory of a proudly naked woman before the fall, with that beautiful and quite daring bust of Eve. Her whole shape has become the snake of temptation. Eve and Adam, they're tempted by the snake in the Garden of Eden. She becomes the snake here, as, women, great deceivers all. She has taken on the sinuous shape of the snake, but that's also practical because this sculpture was designed to go above your head on a lintel, so it had to occupy a very horizontal space. So something that is just a requirement of the space that Juz Liberus is working on, he's able to use in order to give this sculpture something of the symbolism that he is conveying as well. And his crowning work at Autun is the so-called Last Judgment tympanum, which he was clearly so pleased with that he signed as well. And this occupies the narthex of the church. And narthex was a kind of an entrance porch with original church architecture. It's where the unbaptized would listen to services before baptism, because they were only allowed into church to participate in the Mass more fully once they'd been baptized. So in the early days of Christianity, this was a space for them to kind of huddle and hear the benefit of the service before they could actually properly participate in it. But the structure survives over time and is given liturgical use, so is incorporated into the service in other ways. And frequently what we find in Burgundy in the 12th century is that space, a kind of a liminal or threshold space, is used to remind the faithful of what they need to bring to and take away from the service. And often that's a remembrance of the fact that the end is coming and we will all be judged, and we need to have made the right decisions before that moment comes. This was completed circa 1150. It is carved from 29 different stone tablets that are slotted together with precision like a jigsaw, supported by a central carved pillar that was unfortunately later much destroyed and is now principally a modern restoration. And it is miraculous that this survived the French Revolution. It really only did because a few years before, in 1766, it was covered by a wall, and it was only uncovered and restored in 1836. So it escaped destruction in the French Revolution because it wasn't easily seen. Really, Juz Liberus here, I mean, he should have been proud enough to sign it. He signed it. Maybe you can pick that out just underneath Christ's feet. Maybe you can see that it says Juz Liberus hoc fecit. Juz Liberus made this. He should be proud to sign this because the arrangement of these sculptures, if you keep looking at this, you'll see that they are so clearly symmetrical. Christ again shown in majesty in a central mandala or almond shape. He is just a butterfly, and radiating out from him is a very symmetrical arrangement of shapes that is nevertheless different. It's not identical. Different things are happening on the left and right here because this is the moment of judgment. And on the right of Christ, our left, is where you want to be. And on the left of Christ, our right, is not where you want to be. So it can't be the same thing happening. It can't be actually symmetrical. But notice how rhythmic it is. It gives the sense of symmetry as Christ's hands split out from his body, just like his knees split off from his body to give him a sense of shape. And the whole course of judgment is set in place on either side. On his right, we've got Mary, the apostles, we've got St Peter manning, staffing the gate of heaven, and the righteous approaching him. On the left, we've got Michael Archangel. Here he is, together with the devil, both of them engaged in weighing the souls of the dead and working out who has been righteous, who has not, sending the damned, as you can see, off to the right, our right, to be tormented by those ghastly, disproportionate demons in hell. And then back underneath Christ, we have a parade of the blessed on our left and the damned on our right, coming up from the dead at the sound of the angel's trumpet to be weighed by Michael and the devil, and hopefully not found wanting. And then above on the archivolts, on the carved, curved decorations above this tympanum, we have months of the year, signs of the zodiac, symbolic allusions to the entirety of knowledge, a cosmology of knowledge, and the understanding that Christ animates that. He is the center of it, and he decides what goes where. In terms of Romanesque sculpture, a great period of flourishing in the Romanesque arts of architecture and sculpture and painting, and also, not that we'll look at them because we don't have time, decorative arts that are kicked off by the huge growth of the Cluniac order in Burgundy. Autun is right up there with respect to sculpture. But, and we're coming to our conclusion now, it is the power of the Cluniac movement that really sows the seeds of its decline. Its politicians are its abbots rather, and that was a slip of mine, but an interesting one. Its abbots are so powerful that they are really among the chief politicians of Europe. They're more powerful than most kings. They have more wealth than most kings. They rival only the Holy Roman Emperor and Pope for power and jurisdiction over land in Western Europe. And they're connected to those figures. You know, monks from Clooney rise through the church hierarchy and become popes. Urban II, who consecrates Clooney III, had been a monk of Clooney himself. And Abbot Hugh, who will become St Abbot after his death, who you see here at the left in his monkish cowl, he is the godfather of Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, and will be called upon by the emperor, together with the great Countess Matilda of Tuscany, to help resolve one of the great conflicts of the Middle Age, and that is the so-called investiture controversy of 1076, in which the Pope and the Emperor squabble almost to the point of death over who should collect tithes from the great churches and monasteries of Europe. Is it the Pope who gets to take all that money, appoint the priests, appoint the bishops, key point, or is it the Emperor who has control over the bishops and therefore over the money of the church? So it's that power that Clooney grows to occupy that leads to a movement within Burgundy itself, leads to a movement to reform the Benedictine order yet again. You know, the Cluniacs were set up to reform the Benedictine order, but they become so big and powerful within 1,000 years that by the 12th century there is a further reform movement afoot within the area of Burgundy and within the order of the Benedictines. And these communities, led by men like Stephen Harding and Bernard of Clairvaux, they grow in places like Citeaux, south of Dijon, thus giving us today the name for this new order, the Cistercians. But they also grow in places like Fontenay. This is Fontenay Abbey, which was founded by Bernard of Clairvaux in 1119. The Cistercians, as they would come to be called, felt that the Benedictines had not stayed true to their vision through the Cluniac period, that they had been distracted by wealth and power and by the outward trappings of that. Bernard of Clairvaux, he doesn't like visual decoration in churches. He doesn't like the distraction of women to a proper religious life. He thinks that the Holy Land needs to be reconquered for Christianity. He preaches, as I said, the Crusades at the Great Pilgrimage Basilica of Vézelay, dedicated to Mary Magdalene. He advocates for a greater role for the Virgin Mary in church theology, one of the most important Marian theologists of the medieval church. And as a result, Cistercian communities, which, if we go back to that extraordinary map showing the spread of the Cluniacs in red and the Cistercians in blue, as a result, the Cistercians as a reform order become very successful, but they also usher in yet again, a new architectural development because they're focused very much on the utilitarian purpose of buildings. And so architecture doesn't need to be as big and grand and elaborate as the Romanesque had become with something like Clooney 3, or as sculptural decoration had become at places like Autun. Instead, it needs to return to its roots of pray and work, the Great Benedictine Creed, and the technology associated with those things. So Cistercian communities tend to build utilitarian structures. They tend to invest in technology that will help them do their work, things like finishing of textiles, for example, so water wheels. They're really interested in kind of imported technologies from the Arabic world. So it's not that they're anti-intellectual, they're just interested in something else. And they too become very big communities. This is the church at Fontenay Abbey. They too become big. They too have to incorporate large numbers of brothers and large numbers of faithful. And they too, like the Cluniacs, they want to do that in buildings that say something about their mission. And light is very important to the Cistercians in their understanding of the liturgy and of the illuminating role that Christ and the Holy Spirit bring to the religious. And their technology, through the use of things like pointed arches, allows them to engage buildings in different ways that mean that walls can move out, they can become thinner, they can be higher, and they can let in more light. We don't really see these developments, we should say, in Burgundy, the most important architectural and therefore artistic developments, because those kind of walls allow for things like stained glass windows, for example. We see those developments of this style associated with the Cistercians at places like Saint-Denis outside Paris with people like Abbot Suger. So these really interesting developments within the Romanesque style that will actually lead to a new architectural style that we call Gothic. They don't really develop within Burgundy, but the seeds are sown for them in Burgundy with the growth of this new reformed Benedictine order, the Cistercians. Thank you very much for your attention in this presentation about a movement from the Romanesque to the Gothic style and the way in which that's situated in Burgundy.